Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make a pear pie. Gluten-free, of course. And the crust is nothing fancy at all. We'll make that first. It's a really easy crust. So if you're intimidated by a pie crust and a gluten-free pie crust at that, don't worry, this one is super easy. It's also in my cookbook. So I preheated my oven to 375, and this crust recipe is called the Easy Tart Crust from my cookbook. You've seen me make this crust recipe for a lot of different things. It's so fast and easy and delicious. Of course, you don't have to use this crust. You also don't have to put nuts in your crust. Use your favorite pie crust, but this is the one that I like for this pie. So I've got 1 stick of butter here, ½ cup, and it's soft enough I can just mash it with my fork. You don't want it melted, but you do want to be able to mash it around. And then I have 1 1/4 cups of gluten-free flour. I have a 1/4 teaspoon of salt here. And usually for this crust I use honey, but today I'm using date sugar. I'll also be using date sugar in the crumble topping for this pie. So I thought I would just go with the date sugar theme. But you could use white sugar, brown sugar, whatever you like. So I'm just going to dump this all in one and just really start mashing it around with your fork. We don't need a rolling pin for this recipe. We don't need any extra flour for rolling. It really is super fast and easy. If you'd like to make a regular pie crust that is gluten-free, I do have a recipe and video here on my channel for just a pie crust. Single pie crust or a double crust. And then right here I've got a ½ cup of chopped walnuts. I didn't toast them because they're going to be in the oven for quite a while. But you could toast your nuts if you want to. And you don't even have to use walnuts for this recipe. You could use almonds, pecans, whatever your favorite nut is. Or as I mentioned, no nuts at all. And you can see it's really coming together nicely. I've got 1 egg, room temperature. And I like to mix it in this little bowl before I mix it in. That way it's already mixed together and you don't have to worry about getting the yolk and the white evenly throughout your pie crust. All in there. And then just get in there and really get that egg mixed around all of the other ingredients. I'm going to switch to my spatula just so I can scrape the bowl. Make sure everything is getting evenly mixed in. So once you've got your crust ingredients all mixed together, just like this, bring over your pie dish. And I think this is a 9.5-inch pie dish, if I remember right. But you could use this for any size pie dish. If you're using a really deep dish pie dish, you might need a little bit more crust. But that's all right. So I'm going to break it into little pieces here just to make it easier to start spreading out in my pie dish. It's a little bit easier than having one big blob in the middle. And then I still like to use my fork. I'm just going to start spreading it out before I switch to using my hands. Out of all the kitchen tools, a fork is so handy. So mostly what I'm doing here is I'm trying to make sure that I'm getting it all spread out in an even layer towards the edges, and then we'll start working it up the sides of the dish. So now with clean hands, just start pressing it around the pie dish. And I usually try to work from the middle out just so you don't have a bulging middle, and you try to get it evenly around the sides. If you're a person that really likes a thick pie crust, you could double this recipe and then it would be a lot thicker. But I find that this is actually the perfect amount for a pie crust. The only downside is you can't really make a decorative edge at the top. I mean, I guess you could, but I usually don't. And then once I get to the corners, I start working up the side, but I also really try to press in the corner. It helps push it up the sides, but it also makes sure that it's also an even thickness around the corners and not a really big chunk of crust in the corner. And then with my thumb here, it's not quite to the top yet, but it's just a habit to move my thumb along to make it a flat edge. Don't forget about the middle. I always go back and check. And once you've got your crust evenly around, and even though I do push it in the corners, I do want to have crust in the corners. I don't want it to be a super thin crust either. You want it to be able to hold a slice when you cut it. And if I wanted to, I could keep going and make my crust come up to the top of the pan, but I'm not worried about it. This is good enough for me. So set that aside. And now for the filling. I've got about 7 pears here. I don't know that I'll use them all. We're aiming for about 5½, maybe 6 cups of pears. And these are Bartlett pears, and they look so nice, and they are ripe. If you ever buy Bartlett pears, they're green, and then when they turn ripe, they turn kind of this yellow, sometimes a little bit orangey color. Get the stem off of there. And as with any fruit, you want to cut off any bad spots. I've got my handy kitchen bucket there for my compost. And then I take out the core. This is a really good recipe that if you found yourself with a lot of pears at one point and you put some in the freezer, you could use frozen pears for this recipe. You would want to make sure they're well drained. I don't like to peel my pears, but you certainly could if you don't like the peeling on your pears. So I'm just cutting them into bite-sized chunks, maybe a little bit smaller than bite-size. You could slice your pears and then layer them in your pie dish. That might use a little bit more pears, but I really like them to be kind of chunks. Although I shouldn't say that, because there have been times where I do slice it. So you cut your pears however you want to make this pie. And you could use any kind of pear. It doesn't have to be a Bartlett pear. I'm right about 5½ cups right now. This pear was kind of a large one. So it'll probably put me closer to 6 cups of pears, which is just fine. Because in fruit pies always shrink down a little bit once they start baking. And I love pears. So I don't mind if I have extra pears in my pie. And then I've got a lemon here. I just need 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. So I'm not even going to get out my juicer, but I do have my strainer. I don't want any seeds in my pie. And I've actually made this pie before with orange juice instead of lemon juice. Turns out just as delicious. So don't worry if you don't have any lemons, you could use orange juice. And then I've got 2 tablespoons of cornstarch here. I'm actually going to mix my lemon juice with my cornstarch. 1 tablespoon, that's not quite enough. And the reason I'm doing this is because I don't want lumpy cornstarch in with my pears. And because I'm using honey, it's kind of hard to mix cornstarch and honey together. You can, and I've done it before, but I've discovered that just mixing my cornstarch and my lemon juice together, it works out really good. And then once we pour it on our pears, it will loosen up with the pear juice. But it kind of makes a thick cornstarch slurry. There we go. I'm going to use my same spatula here that I used for my crust. When the holidays are here, I end up with dishpan hands because I do so many dishes because I'm cooking so much. So anywhere that I can reuse the same dishes and not have to wash them in between is a time saver. So now that I've got my cornstarch and my lemon juice in with my pears, I can add in the rest of my ingredients. I've got a 1/4 cup of honey. The original recipe calls for white sugar, but I really like the honey with the pears. And then I have a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, a 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, and a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. So you want to give this a really good stir, but be gentle. If your pears are super ripe, you don't want to just mash them. But you really want to make sure you get that cornstarch mixture, the honey, and your spices all mixed around. Give myself some room here. Bring over your pie dish, and then we'll just get this dumped into our prepared crust. When you're smoothing it out, you want to be careful not to gouge your crust. But when you're dealing with fruit chunks like this, sometimes you might have a little pocket underneath. So I try to make sure that there's no big pockets in there. Although with fruit, it will sink down when cooking. So now this is ready to go in the oven. I do have a foil-lined cookie sheet here. Whenever you're making fruit pies, especially when they're mounded and kind of full like this, you don't want it to bubble over in your oven. It will make such a mess, and then you might forget that it happened. I don't know how you could, but I have. And then when you go to turn your oven on to bake something else, it burns and smokes, and then you have a bigger mess later on. So always use at least a cookie sheet. You don't have to line it with foil. That just makes easy cleanup. So in the oven for about 35 minutes. So while the pie is in the oven, I have the ingredients for, it's kind of a streusel topping that will go on this pie. If you wanted to, you could make a double crust and then just do a lattice topping for this pie. But I really like this crumbly streusel topping. And then I've got the same dirty bowl that I made my bottom crust in. It's almost the same ingredients. Why not use it? So in this bowl, I've got 6 tablespoons of butter. And I do have it cut up, but it is pretty soft at room temperature. And then I have 1 cup of my gluten-free flour, all in there, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and then I do have 2/3 of a cup of date sugar. And date sugar is kind of lumpy. So with a fork, I'm gonna mash my butter and flour and date sugar together. And then you can easily break up the big chunks of date sugar. I shouldn't say mash, more like stir around until we can get in there with our hands. And you can see my butter is not, it's at room temperature, but you can still mash it, but it's not just melting. So I'm gonna switch to my fingers and then start breaking apart my pieces of butter and really mixing with my flour and date sugar. If you don't like date sugar, you could use your favorite sugar. You could use white sugar, brown sugar, coconut sugar. I even have recipes here on my channel for a crumble topping with maple syrup or honey. But I think the pear pie with a date crumble topping goes together perfectly. Now I'm not looking for my butter pieces to be super fine like we're making a pastry crust or something like that. I do want some big chunks for my streusel topping. And you could do this in a food processor, but that usually blends up the butter to a lot smaller pieces than what I like it to be. So once it looks like this, where it's still kind of powdery, but you do have some pretty big chunks of butter in there, but mostly, you know, smallish pieces, except for that one. You don't want really big pieces of butter that haven't been worked in, but I don't mind if there's, maybe that size pieces of butter. And then I just keep going, just to double check. There we go. I'm gonna clean up really quick, switch back to my fork, give everything a good stir, and then I've got 1 tablespoon of heavy cream. We're gonna pour that in. Get my spatula here, and then just mix it together with our fork. If your kitchen is really hot, you'll want to stick this mixture in the fridge. But even with my oven on, my kitchen stays on the cooler side, so I'm just going to leave this sit out at room temperature. It's been about 35 minutes, and this is where we put on our streusel topping. Very carefully. Find it's easiest to kind of mound it in the middle and then gently spread it out. Don't drop your bowl in your pie. But look, no one will ever know. You just cover it right up with your topping. And be careful because the pan is hot, but I try to go all the way to the edge. I don't know if you guys have noticed or not, but I'm kind of clumsy. And most of the time I edit out all of my little clumsy, dropping things or, things like this, but that one you couldn't really come back from. You'd see the big dent from the bowl. So now that your topping is evenly covering your pie, I'm going to turn the pie around so that, I don't know if you noticed or not, but this edge of my crust is darker than this side. My oven just bakes that way. So I'm going to put this darker side towards the door. And then we're going to bake this for another 30 minutes or so. If during that time you feel like your topping is getting too brown, you can cover it with foil. So I usually check it at about 15 minutes and then go for another 15 minutes. Woo. All the things not to do in a kitchen. My pear pie has been cooling off for a couple of hours. It's still just barely warm on the bottom. This kind of a pie you can serve warm or chilled. I wouldn't recommend hot right out of the oven because it might not hold together. But it sure looks good and smells good. Very carefully, you want to get all the way to the edge here and get the crust. And as we all know, the first piece is always a challenge, especially on a warm pie. Oh, and it's warm enough that it is falling apart. It sure looks good. I don't care that it's falling apart. Let me turn this around so you can see. And even though my piece of pie fell apart, it's holding a slice really well. So after cooling off completely and then storing in the fridge, it will hold a slice even better. But I don't mind. And then I've got some whipped cream here. You could serve this with ice cream, whatever you like. So let's take a bite. It sure smells good. It is so good. My crust is really good. My topping is really good. I really like using date sugar. It sweetens your dessert without being overly sweet. It does give the crumble topping a little bit different of a texture, but I don't mind. Date sugar goes so well with fruit. If you've never had a pear pie before, you should try this pie. It's nothing fancy at all, but the pears are so delicious. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any questions or comments, let me know, and I'll see you on the next one.